The Hounds of Streckler by Michael Samerdyke. Hey, do you think this is scary? Franklin Hammer thrust the red devil mask with horns and chin that pointed forward at the viewer in front of Bill Moore's face. Whoa! The reporter jerked his right arm off the steering wheel and pushed the mask away. A sigh came from the back seat. I hope you boys know it'll be taken as American bad manners if we don't show up at the masquerade because we've been killed. Bill gave the rearview mirror a quick glance. That blonde hair must have come out of a bottle, he thought for the 10th time. Right as usual, Miss Chandler. I'll be sure to get us there in one piece so our German hosts have nothing to complain about. Franklin Hammer studied the devil mask. He tapped the horns with his index finger and laughed. This will make me the most frightening one at the masquerade. From behind him came Gladys Chandler's laugh. Colonel Metevny, Bill said as the car picked up speed. The Colonel will be there, Frank, Gladys said, looking at the back of Bill's head as if she wanted to stick her tongue out at it. Wherever he goes, he's always the most frightening one there. Now, Gladys, Frank said. He lost his arm fighting for his country. He looked out the window at the flat, gloomy Brandenburg countryside they were speeding through. For that matter, he lost his country. Empire, Bill said. By the time he escaped from wherever the hell the Russians sent him, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was no more, and his family estates had ended up in Romania. Do tell, Mr. Professor, Gladys said, throwing herself against the back seat. Something like that could sour a man, Bill said. But anyway, there are some who could say that Dr. Streckler will be the most frightening man there tonight. What are you, a walking encyclopedia? Gladys flung her scarf so its tail could flap like a banner outside the window as the car motored along. Just a Yank who didn't want to go back to the farm after I'd seen Paris. Bill squinted into the gathering twilight. We left Charlottenburg about an hour ago, so we should be there pretty soon. He pointed. I think that might be the place. A massive roof and slender turret thrust above the trees in the distance. Nice little shack, Frank said. If Mother saw it, she'd have Father build her one just like it. If you'd been here a couple of years ago, you could have bought the original and shipped it back to the Hudson for next to nothing, Bill said. Their money was worthless then. I had heard that, Frank said. Just then the howling of several dogs rolled across the gathering dimness over their car. Bill switched the headlights on and quickly patted his overcoat near his left arm, a movement that Frank, looking out toward the source of the howling, failed to see. That must be the place. Dr. Streckler is known for his hounds and the privacy they give him. Frank stepped on the gas. Anyway, the inflation was how Streckler could buy the place. The original owners went bust. The old man shot himself, and his daughters wound up working in the Kudam. I've never met anyone who knows as much about everything as you, Gladys said, then leaned forward so her lips were close to his ears. How did you know about the daughters? How did you meet Colonel Metevny? Bill asked Frank as he slowed down to turn onto the long driveway. An iron gate blocked their way, and a stocky man in a dark green uniform strode out from the east sentry box on the side of the gate. He stepped into the light cast by the shadows. Gladys leaned back as far away from him as she could. The gateman's face wore a perpetual frown, thanks to several scars on either side of his mouth, and his nose had clearly lost some flesh over the years. Here's our invitation, Frank handed the letter to Bill. I saw him with Metevny at the Green Falcon. I think he drives for him. Bill held the invitation in front of the gateman's impassive face. After some wordless moments passed, the gateman turned around without a word and walked back into the sentry box with a deliberate tread. I've been in France and Germany for about 10 years now, Bill said, but even I have to say that guy looks foreign. I think the Colonel picked him up in his travels. He saved his life, or the other way around. Bill shook his head. I'd hate to see what those eyes have seen. The iron gate silently drew to the left. Bill whistled at the neatness of the device. Then the gatekeeper waved at the gatekeeper and drove past. You met the Colonel at the Green Falcon. I don't think your mother would approve of her son visiting such a place. Prohibition doesn't prevent me from drinking over here. I wasn't referring to the booze. Bill pulled up in front of the mansion and parked the car. If you came to Berlin to broaden your education, you were certainly well advised to go to the Green Falcon. Gladys lit a cigarette and blew smoke at Bill. Frank can get into a lot of places a lot of people can't. Bill looked at her. I'm well aware of what Frank can get into. The howling burst loose again, sounding especially frantic this time. I really pity any burglars who paid Herr Dr. Streckler a midnight call, Bill said, patting his overcoat. There's someone at the door, Frank pointed at the mansion. Let's go in. Frank got out and pushed his seat forward for Gladys, but turned to wait for Frank. He began to push his seat forward, but stopped and retrieved the devil mask from the seat. Don't want anything to happen to this old boy. Gladys looked as if she had bitten an extremely strong pickle. Frank pushed his seat down for her, and she stepped out. Did you bring your mask? He asked. With a sigh, she reached into the back seat and brought out a cat's mask. Meow, she said, holding it in front of her face. It captures your nature, Bill said before turning to look at the mansion and letting out a low whistle. Dr. Streckler really got himself a bargain. The Americans walked toward the mansion, and Bill laughed. How old do you think this place is? Gladys took a last puff on her cigarette and tossed it to the ground. Older than Plymouth Rock, she said. It's as old as the hammer pile at Newport, give or take a decade, Bill shook his head. Toys paid for all this. It looks old, Gladys said. On the contrary, it's so modern that the doorman is a movie star. Frank and Gladys blinked at this statement, then looked at the doorman, who awaited them as if speared in place upright on a ramrod. The only hair on his head was his eyebrows, and he stared straight ahead as they approached. Frank laughed. Of course, the man you love to hate. The doorman didn't blink or show any emotion. Your invitation, please, he asked. Frank handed him the invitation, and the man's eyes narrowed as he scrutinized every word. Finally, he raised his attention from the paper and looked at the three Americans. He didn't smile. You are Mr. Hammer? He asked Frank. I am. He pointed at Bill. And who is this? Frank stopped smiling. This is my friend, Bill Moore. I brought him along. If he has to go back to Berlin, I won't be heartbroken, Gladys said. I must speak to Herr Dr. Streckler about this. You will wait here. Look, I'm a friend of Colonel Matevny. Frank put his hand on the doorman's shoulder. Just be a good sport and let us in. The colonel will vouch for me. Frank's eyes widened in amazement as the doorman gripped his wrist. I must speak to Herr Dr. Streckler about this. You will wait here. Just let the man do his job, Frank, Bill said. It's what krauts like him live for. Okay. Frank smiled and let go of the doorman's shoulder. Unsmiling, the doorman released Frank's wrist. You will stay here, he said, and turned to go inside. That guy barks almost as good as Streckler's dogs, Bill said, watching the doorman walk away as Gladys rubbed Frank's wrist. Probably about as loyal and as smart. He shook his head. Matevny and Streckler, you really found yourself some interesting friends, Mr. Hammer. Like you, I want to see Paris instead of staying on an American farm and meet some others, people who aren't self-satisfied Babbitts. Well, I've never seen them, but I'm certain Matevny and Streckler aren't Babbitts. The mansion door opened and the doorman came out, followed by a tall man in a tuxedo. His hair was white and seemed to stand straight up. It had been cut in such a way that his head seemed rather box-shaped with perfect flat edges. His eyes were cold, and he held no welcome, although he smiled. Forgive this misunderstanding. We Germans are rather inclined to stand on formalities, and Fritz here was simply doing what I had instructed. I am Dr. Gustav Streckler. Welcome to my home, Mr. Hammer. He nodded his head slightly, then turned to Gladys. And your charming companion is? Gladys Chandler. She even tried to curtsy. Very good. Dr. Streckler now turned to Bill. And you are the gentleman who caused all the difficulty. Your name is? Bill Moore. Dr. Streckler's face lit up with interest, and his eyes took in Bill as if seeing him for the first time. "Ah, you are Bill Moore. It is a pleasure to meet you after reading your material in the Times Herald for so long." "A newspaper man? A reporter?" Frank blinked in surprise. "Quite the reporter. His stories on the visits of your film stars to our Berlin nightclubs make the most enjoyable reading, even for sedentary persons such as myself. Are you a film star, Mr. Hammer, or is there another reason why Mr. Moore would want to attach himself to you?" Frank stepped in front of Bill nose to nose. "You bastard! You're just waiting for me to make an ass out of myself and splash it across the headlines." "Ah, I seem to have let the cat out of the bag, to use your charming American expression." Dr. Streckler smiled, revealing his teeth. "Let us declare an armistice for the evening and enjoy ourselves. I'm sure Miss Chandler would like to go inside, and I might suggest, Mr. Franklin, that perhaps Mr. Moore is less interested in you than in the moon murders. I think your last article dealt with that sordid topic, did it not, Mr. Moore?" "It did, Herr Doctor." Bill turned to Frank. "Look, you're an okay kid. I told you I was a writer, and you didn't dope it out for yourself. I just wanted to hang with some Americans. I promise not to make you look like an idiot in print." Frank turned away from him. "Come on, Gladys, let's go inside." "Show them in, Fritz." With a click of his heels, Fritz led Frank and Gladys into the mansion, while Dr. Streckler put a hand on Bill's shoulder. "Give me the gun you have on your overcoat, and you can go inside. And if I don't, then my hounds will have a slightly less healthy, but more entertaining meal than they are used to." "You're a real charmer," Bill said as he unbuttoned his overcoat and handed the revolver to Dr. Streckler. "Now you may go inside." Followed by Dr. Streckler, Bill walked to the door and entered. Gladys, who had shed her coat, glowed like a beacon in her gold lame dress. She looked around and held the cat mask as if not sure what to do with it. Frank scowled at Bill and seemed to be gripping the devil mask so he couldn't punch the reporter in the nose. "Ah, the Americans have arrived." Everyone turned to see the trim, dark-haired man in the green uniform and cape who strode forward with his left arm extended. "Enchanté, my dear," he said to Gladys, drawing her hand up to his lips before she really knew what was happening. "How delightful that you are here." "Delighted," she said, barely above a whisper. "Real pleasure to see you again, Colonel," Frank said, extending his right hand, which the Colonel grabbed with his left and pumped vigorously. "My young American friend. How wonderful." "And dear Matevny," Streckler said, "this is Bill Moore." Matevny's head turned to look at Bill, and his eyebrows rose. A thin smile that held a trace of mockery appeared on his lips. "We didn't expect Mr. Moore this evening, but I imagine that appearing where he is unexpected is what makes him such a good reporter." He nodded his head. "Greetings, Mr. Moore." Dr. Streckler clapped his hands twice. The sound exploded like a gunshot, and Gladys dropped her mask with a shriek. With a deep bow, Colonel Matevny retrieved it from the floor, while a tall man in a mask and powdered wig from an 18th century livery attended and stood to attention. "Semyon, one of our guests needs a mask," Dr. Streckler said. The servant, his features hidden by the painted face of an old man with vivid red cheeks, turned his head slightly to see Colonel Matevny better. A slight nod from the colonel sent the servant back as silently as he came. "Semyon came with the colonel on his odyssey to Berlin," Dr. Streckler chuckled. "I've never seen more loyalty in a non-canine being." "It seems like everyone knew that Bill was a reporter except me," Frank said. "Mr. Moore is one of the leading lights of the American community in Berlin. Even a relative stranger to the American idiom like myself can enjoy his prose," Dr. Streckler said, turning from Frank to Colonel Matevny. "I think he is extremely well informed on the moon murders." "Curious thing for an intelligent man to be so interested in," the colonel said. "No doubt you will write about it in order to sell more papers. It seems that the recent war awakened an appetite for death in the multitudes." "I'm afraid it has," Bill said, and looked around the hall. "It is a splendid house." "Ah, but you haven't seen its real glory." Dr. Streckler beamed like a schoolboy and rubbed his hands together. Onward to the playroom, where I shall explain the rules of the masquerade." "Rules?" Frank asked. "My masquerades aren't simply parties," Streckler said as he led them past several portraits of somber, jowly men in grey jackets. "Pay no attention to these. They are not my ancestors. My masquerades are more like dramas, unique events with each participant playing a special role." "Most unique event," Colonel Mattevny said to Gladys as he loomed over her. "Have an unforgettable experience before you." "I see that Miss Chandler has selected a feline persona," Dr. Streckler said as he turned to smile at her. "Perfect. Cats accompany the devil so well. You will be my consort for the evening." "But I'm the devil," Frank said, holding up his mask to show his host. "That is a good mask," Streckler said, reaching out his hands for it. He examined it front and back and raised it to cover his face. "However, as this is my house, my rules are that there will only be one devil, and I always play him. So another role will have to be found for you." I didn't know." Dr. Streckler raised a hand. "No trouble at all, young man. I have the perfect part in mind for you already." He held the devil mask under his left arm and stopped before the two wide double doors. Turning, he smiled back to the guests and put his hand on the right handle. "I would never have guessed that this kind of thing would be to my taste, but having found this when I purchased this house, I fell in love with it. May I present the playroom?" He bowed his head to them, turned the handle, and pulled the door open. Curious, the Americans drew closer together and stepped into the room. Instantly they gasped at the cheerful lights and metallic chatter that met them. Around the wall of the room at shoulder height, a toy train chugged past toy trees and mountains and through tiny villages with clock towers and church spires. From the ceiling hung a tiny tin zeppelin, turning clockwise around the room on a steel rod as its shiny propellers spun. Beneath the rod stood a podium that supported a shiny chessboard, on which stood chessmen nearly 6 inches tall, one clad in medieval armor, the other in barbarous fur. "The Colonel is a splendid opponent," Dr. Streckler said, walking up to the board and picking up the barbarian queen. "We play," he looked at the feminine figure in his hands, "with most unusual stakes." "Frankly, it's hard to imagine either of the two of you men in these surroundings," Bill said, looking around at all the playthings. "Although I could see you on the bridge of one of those, Dr. Streckler," he pointed at the tin zeppelin. "On your way to bombing London." Dr. Streckler smiled coldly. "The toy is a prototype for a passenger liner that was never built because of the war. I seem to have forgotten that Anglo-Saxons think it is more sporting to starve people to death than to drop high explosive on them." "I think," Colonel Mattevny said, stepping between the two men, "that Mr. Hammer needs to find out about his part in tonight's masquerade." "Of course." Dr. Streckler walked over to a miniature mountain and pressed a button next to the toy railroad track. Suddenly they became aware of Semyon standing in the open doorway. He held a mask that was topped by a long and soft green hat with a bell sewn in its tip. As the servant held out the mask, the bell jingled. "The jester," Dr. Streckler said, "bringing mirth and lightening sorrow wherever he goes. I envy your role, Mr. Hammer. Bringing mirth is a skill that I sadly lack." "It's not very dignified," Frank said, walking over and taking the mask from Semyon. "But the jester is of vital importance to our entertainment this evening," Colonel Mattevny said. "The festivities can't begin without him." He put his arm on the American's shoulder. "Follow Semyon. He will show you what is expected of the jester." "Well, okay." Frank waved at Bill and Gladys and followed Semyon out of the playroom. Bill nodded at him and then turned to Dr. Streckler. "Shouldn't that have been my mask?" "You may select your mask from one of these." Dr. Streckler pressed another button and a section of the wall began to slide up to reveal 5 dog masks. "Since you seem to disagree with Miss Chandler about everything, I think you should select from the canine family." Bill grabbed the nearest mask, a St. Bernard, and put it on. "What about you and the Colonel?" he asked as he turned. He stopped suddenly. Dr. Streckler wore a devil's mask. It was gray and not red, and it lacked horns, but the bitter sneer on its wooden lips left no doubt as to who it depicted. Next to him stood a man with the death's head mask. "I am always the devil, and Colonel Matevny is always death. It is the only way we play." The devil turned toward Gladys. "Cover your face, child. The masquerade is about to begin." Looking at Bill, Gladys put the mask on with shaky hands. "Excellent," Death said, running his fingers through her golden hair before letting his hand rest on her shoulder. "Let us now go up the stairs to the picture window to see how this drama begins." With the devil behind him, Bill walked out of the playroom. He took Gladys's hand, and they walked down the hall, past Fritz, who wore a furred Turkish helmet and held a candelabra. The servant's eyes revealed nothing about what would happen next. "You know that Frank's family is pretty important," Bill said. "His mother is sister to at least 2 ambassadors." "It can be useful," Death said, "at certain times." They reached the landing and stepped close to the glass of the window. 4 torches had been attached to spears driven into the ground of the lawn beneath them, and the flames danced as if lashed by a breeze. Fritz raised the candelabra, then lowered it, signaling to someone outside. A pistol shot rang out, its report nearly muffled by the glass. A second shot followed, and beneath them a man ran into the square of light created by the torches. He turned, and the party could see his belled green cap. "Frank!" Gladys raised her hand to her whispered lips. As if from far away came the baying of hounds, as sleek black shapes bounded into the light below. Gladys turned away from the window, but Death's firm hand gripped her neck and forced her head around so she had to look. Bill reached for Death, but felt a metallic gun barrel press against the base of his skull. "Watch," the devil commanded. Below, the man screamed and jerked back and forth as the hounds gripped both his arms. He tried to shake them loose, but the beasts held tight until he fell to his knees. The largest hound strode toward him, crouched, and leaped for his throat. Gladys screamed and struck her head against the window. Death pulled her away from the glass, but let her turn back to the feeding outside. The gun vanished from the back of Bill's head, and the reporter grabbed Gladys before she collapsed. The 2 looked at their hosts. "Drama has begun," Death said. "Let us play games," the devil said.